My name is Ari Friedlander. I'm an assistant professor in the English department here at UD. My research interests are Shakespeare and his contemporaries and the history of sexuality and gender, particularly in the Renaissance era. Let me begin by just talking briefly about Shakespeare's First Folio, which preceded the Second Folio. Shakespeare's First Folio is really important in the history of the English language and the history of the book and in the history of English literature, in part because it's the only source for some of Shakespeare's plays that are, of course, very famous today, like The Tempest. But it's also really important because it's one of the first books that collects the work of an author in a single volume, a work of a literary author in a single volume. It's a very socially radical thing to do, particularly for playwrights who were considered sort of one step above vagabonds and bums in the Renaissance. I happen to have here the Norton facsimile of Shakespeare's First Folio, and you can see that it's very big. Right? So it's a prestigious volume, and another thing it does is that it has a lot of what we call paratextual material, which is poems written in honor of the author, which had to be paid for, right? And they attest to the value of what's inside. That actually one of the major differences between the First Folio and the Second Folio is that there's one extra commendatory poem at the beginning by a scholar or a young poet, first published poem ever that we have of his. We think it's his first published poem ever, by the name of John Milton. Milton, of course, is the famous author. He would grow to be the famous author of Paradise Lost. It's titled On Shakespeare. What needs my Shakespeare for his honored bones, the labor of an age in piled stones? Or that his hallowed relics, meaning his bones, should be hid under a star-appointing pyramid, right? Here Milton is questioning, why does Shakespeare need a monument, like a grave, right? He doesn't need that. What needst thou such, dear son of memory, great heir of fame? What needst thou such weak witness of thy name? Thou, in our wonder and astonishment, hast built thyself a lifelong monument, right? So it's the way in which you live on in our memory that is the monument. You don't need a big grave, right? For whilst to the shame of slow endeavouring art thy easy numbers flow, and that each heart hath from the leaves of thy unvalued book, that means invaluable in the Renaissance, those Delphic lines with deep impression took, then thou, our fancy of itself bereaving, dost make us marble with too much conceiving, and so, sepulchred in such pomp dost lie, that kings for such a tomb would wish to die. And so those final lines are about the experience of reading Shakespeare and how astonishing, literally turning into stone, the experience is. But what I think is really interesting about it for our purposes is that it also registers some ambivalence about the notion of collecting Shakespeare, monumentalizing him in this book, right? But it says, what do you need a monument for, right? You have our memory, right, of you and of your work. And, you know, of course, it also cuts against that sentiment, but it's there in the poem, that ambivalence. And I think that, you know, we often ignore this poem when thinking about Shakespeare, just like we ignore all the commendatory poems. When we read this poem, we think about what Milton's development was like, right? But one of the great things about having the Second Folio here in Dayton as part of the Stuart Rose book exhibit is that it reminds us to reconsider the book as a whole for what it tells us about Shakespeare at the moment of his publication, right? At the cultural moment of his publication. I think everybody's going to hopefully get something different from their encounter with this exhibit. But if I had to choose one thing, I would say that that I would want them to come away with an appreciation for what what this says about what how Shakespeare's culture valued Shakespeare, um, and um, and perhaps I would hope this would impress upon them, a renewed appreciation for Shakespeare in our own day. I think that it reminds us that today Shakespeare has all this cultural cachet, and too often, we even so in our day-to-day lives we neglect him. So I would hope that we take inspiration from the daringness of Shakespeare's editors and collators of the past to approach Shakespeare with renewed enthusiasm today.